The pistol appeared in Bradford's hand, moonlight catching the barrel. He raised it, aimed at Margaret's chest, his smile cold in the starlight. "I want you to know this isn't personal, just business. You should have run when you had the chance." His finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot split the night. But it wasn't Bradford who fired. To understand how Margaret Fletcher ended up on a midnight road with a gun pointed at her heart and a 9-year-old boy's life in the balance, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a dusty train platform in Cedar Mill, Texas, where she learned that some promises weigh heavier than luggage, and some men abandon you without ever showing their face. Margaret Fletcher was 24 years old when she learned that hope could weigh more than the trunk she dragged across the dusty platform. Sweat traced down her spine, soaking through the blue calico dress, the only one she'd kept after her mother died. 4 days on the train, 2,000 miles from Pennsylvania, $40 everything she owned spent on the ticket. And now, standing in the brutal June sun of Cedar Mill, Texas, Margaret understood a cruel truth. Some promises weigh heavier than luggage, and some men abandon you without ever showing their face. The stagecoach driver had already departed, leaving clouds of dust that settled slowly in the still air. Margaret stood alone on the wooden platform, one hand gripping the marriage certificate that bore 2 signatures. Hers written in the careful script her mother had taught her at the kitchen table when the world still made sense. And his, William Barrett. A confident flourish she'd never seen, made only received through 6 months of letters that painted pictures of a life she'd never have. The station master watched her from beneath the shade of his office overhang. An older man weathered by decades of Texas sun, with eyes that had seen this scene before. Women arriving, men not waiting. The arithmetic of broken promises played out on platforms just like this one. Margaret approached him, the certificate trembling slightly in her hands. "Sir, I'm looking for William Barrett. He was supposed to meet me here. We're to be married." The station master removed his hat, wiped his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "Ma'am, I've been running this station 12 years. Know every rancher, every homesteader in 3 counties. Ain't no William Barrett." The words landed like stones in still water ripples spreading outward until they touched everything. "You sure you got the right town?" His voice carried a gentleness that somehow made it worse. "Cedar Mill, Texas. That's what the letter said. He sent me $40 for the ticket. Her voice caught. "He signed the marriage certificate already, to make it proper when I arrived." The station master's expression shifted, something between pity and anger crossing his weathered face. "I'm sorry, miss. Real sorry. But whoever that man was, he ain't here. Never has been." Margaret heard the words, but her mind refused them entry. She walked to the general store, asked about William Barrett, shook heads, to the hotel, more shaking heads, to the small Methodist church with its modest bell tower. The Reverend, a kind man with white hair and patient eyes, listened to her story and offered what he could. A meal, a prayer, but no William Barrett. By evening, as the June sun painted the western sky in shades of copper and rose, Margaret Fletcher understood with absolute clarity that she had traveled 2,000 miles to meet a man who existed only in ink and lies. To understand how Margaret ended up so far from home with nothing but a falsehood, you must understand what she was running from. Winter had come early to Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1883, the kind of cold that seeped through walls and settled in bones, that made breath visible and fingers numb even by the fire. Margaret's younger sister Emily lay in the narrow bed they'd shared since childhood, her face flushed with fever, her breathing labored and wet. The influenza had swept through the coal mining towns like a scythe through wheat. It took the young and the old, the weak and the strong, with a democracy that offered no mercy. Emily was 19, mother to 8-year-old Tommy, abandoned by the boy's father 2 winters before. "Promise me." Emily's hand gripped Margaret's with surprising strength. "Promise you'll take care of Tommy. Give him a better life than this." Margaret pressed a cool cloth to her sister's forehead, fighting back tears that would do no good. "You're going to be fine. The fever will break." But they both knew. In coal country, when the wet cough came, when the fever climbed and wouldn't fall, when breath grew short and labored, you knew. Promise me, Maggie. I promise. Emily died 3 hours later, her hand still in Margaret's. Tommy crying silently in the corner of the room, old beyond his years, in the way children of poverty often are. The funeral cost $2. Margaret worked 14-hour days at the textile mill for 40 cents. It took 5 days of wages to bury her sister in frozen ground beside their parents. 5 days of Tommy going hungry so there would be money for a proper burial. The mill closed in March. Coal prices had fallen. Demand had dropped. One by one, the industries that sustained the town shuttered their doors, leaving families with nothing but desperation and diminishing hope. Margaret tried. She took in washing mended clothes, cleaned houses for the few families who still had money. But feeding a growing boy and herself on scraps and charity was a mathematics problem with no solution. That's when she saw the advertisement. It was tucked in the back pages of the Pennsylvania Gazette among notices for patent medicines and farm equipment. Simple black type on white paper. Respectable rancher seeks wife. Must be willing to work. Good Christian woman preferred. Children welcome. Send correspondence to W. Barrett, Cedar Mill, Texas. Children welcome. Those 2 words changed everything. Margaret composed her letter that evening by lamplight. Tommy asleep in the corner, his thin frame barely making a shape beneath the worn blanket. She wrote about her skills, her work ethic, her faith. She mentioned Tommy, carefully explaining he was her nephew, orphaned, good and quiet and willing to work. The response came 2 weeks later. William Barrett's handwriting was confident, his words reassuring. He described a ranch in the hill country of Texas, cattle grazing on good grass, a house he was building with his own hands. He wrote about loneliness, about needing a partner to share the work and the life. He asked about Tommy's age, his health, his temperament. The letters continued for 6 months. Each one painted the picture more vividly. The porch he was building because he imagined sitting there in the evenings watching the sun set over the hills. The apple trees he'd plant in spring because every home needed the smell of blossoms. The room he'd prepare for Tommy with a real bed and a window that caught the morning light. And then came the marriage certificate already signed on his end with $40 tucked inside the envelope. "Come to Cedar Mill," the letter said. "I'll be waiting at the station. We'll start our life together." Margaret sold everything. The bed, the table, her mother's dishes, the trunk that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything except what would fit in one smaller trunk and what she and Tommy could wear. The neighbors whispered as she packed. Mail-order bride. Desperate. What kind of man needs to buy a wife? But Margaret didn't care. This was Tommy's chance. This was their chance. A new life in a place where winter didn't kill and poverty wasn't the only option, and hope might actually mean something. The train journey took 4 days. Margaret watched the landscape change outside the window, the industrial east giving way to farmland, the farmland to plains, the plains to something wild and open that both thrilled and terrified her. Tommy pressed his face to the glass, eyes wide, drinking in every mile of country he'd never imagined. "Will he like me?" Tommy asked on the 3rd day. "He'll love you," Margaret promised, believing it with everything she had. But William Barrett hadn't been at the station. And as the sun set on her first day in Cedar Mill, Margaret Fletcher understood that some promises are made to be broken, and some hope exists only to teach you how much losing it can hurt. The shed behind the livery stable smelled of leather and horse sweat and decades of accumulated work. Old Tom, the stable owner, was a weathered man of 70, with kind eyes and few words. He offered Margaret the space in exchange for mucking out stalls 3 mornings a week. "Ain't much," he said, "but it's dry and it's yours long as you hold up your end." Margaret thanked him, her voice steady despite everything. The shed had been a tack room once. Now it was a 10 by 12-foot space with gaps in the wooden walls that let in slivers of light and all the cold. A dirt floor packed hard by decades of boots. Hooks on the walls where saddles once hung, and nothing else. Margaret spread the horse blanket she'd been given on the ground, set her trunk against the wall, propped the cracked mirror she'd found discarded behind the general store in the corner. This was home now. Tommy emerged from the shadows of the livery stable after dark, moving quiet as a ghost. He'd hidden in the freight car during the final leg of the journey, terrified that if anyone saw him, they'd send him back to Pennsylvania, back to the orphanage, back to a life Margaret had promised to save him from. "Aunt Maggie." His voice was small in the darkness. "I'm scared." She pulled him close, both of them sitting on the horse blanket in a shed that smelled like other people's work. "I know, sweetheart. I'm scared too. What if people find out I'm here? Then we'll deal with it, together." She didn't tell him about the 73 cents left from the $40, didn't tell him that she'd spent the last of their money on train fare and had nothing left for food or medicine or the inevitable emergencies that poverty always brings. Didn't tell him she had no plan, no prospects, no idea how they'd survive. Instead, she held him while he cried quietly, and when he fell asleep she pulled out the marriage certificate and stared at William Barrett's signature until the lamp oil ran low and darkness claimed the shed. Her grandmother's voice came to her then, a memory so vivid it felt like the old woman was sitting beside her in the gloom. "When the Lord closes a door, child, He opens a window. You just got to be brave enough to climb through." Margaret folded the certificate, tucked it deep in her apron pocket, and made herself a different promise. She would survive this. She would protect Tommy. She would find that window. She just had no idea how. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm of work and worry. Margaret rose before dawn, mucked stalls for old Tom, while Tommy hid in the shed, then took whatever day labor she could find. Mrs. Hensley hired her to do laundry, 11 hours of scrubbing and wringing and hanging for 50 cents. The apothecary missed her. Pruitt bought bundles of feverfew and yarrow that Margaret gathered along Cypress Creek for 10 cents each. Tommy helped where he could, running errands for a few pennies, staying quiet and invisible the way Margaret taught him. The town didn't know about the boy yet, and Margaret intended to keep it that way as long as possible. The town women whispered when Margaret passed. She felt their eyes, heard the fragments of conversation that followed her like smoke. "That's the one. Mail order bride nobody wanted. Living in a shed. Can you imagine? Probably for the best. Woman like that coming all this way to trap a man." Margaret kept her head high and her face still. Pride wouldn't fill an empty belly, her mother used to say, but it would keep your spine straight when the world tried to break you. On the afternoon that changed everything, Margaret walked to Cypress Creek with her gathering basket. The creek ran clear over limestone, cutting through hills covered in live oak and juniper. The air smelled of sage and wild grass, and the particular sweetness of a Texas summer afternoon. Feverfew grew thick along the bank's clusters of white flowers nodding in the breeze. Yarrow sprouted in patches near the bends where limestone shelved over the water. Margaret worked methodically, filling her basket, calculating in her head. 3 bundles at 10 cents each would buy bread for tomorrow and maybe a bit of salt pork. A mockingbird sang its complex song from a cypress branch. 3 notes repeated, then 3 more in a different key. Margaret paused to listen, allowing herself one moment of peace in a life that offered few. Then she saw the horse. A chestnut mare stood in the shallows 20 feet upstream, water to her knees, drinking with the patient deliberation of an animal that knows no urgency. The afternoon sun caught the silver conchos on her saddle, real silver, not tin. The reins dragged in the creek, dark leather, trailing like something forgotten. No rider. Margaret's father had been a practical man given to sayings that carried the weight of experience. "A horse without a man," he'd told her once, "means the man's found trouble or trouble's found him." She should leave, walk back to town, tell the sheriff, let someone else handle whatever this was. But her eyes had already found what she knew she'd find. First the boot, good leather worn at the heel but expensive once, then the leg. Then the man face down at the water's edge, one arm stretched toward the creek like he'd been reaching for a drink he never got. Margaret's basket fell from her hands, feverfew scattering on the limestone. She moved without deciding to, feet sliding on wet stone, her dress soaking up creek water as she dropped to her knees beside him. The smell hit her first. Copper and dirt and something raw. Blood. A lot of it. She grabbed his shoulders, solid and heavy with the terrible weight of unconsciousness, and rolled him onto his back. A man. Late 30s, maybe 40. Dark hair going gray at the temples. Strong jaw covered in 3 days of stubble. A face that might have been handsome before pain and injury twisted it into a grimace. His shirt was soaked through on the right side, the fabric torn where something sharp had caught it. Margaret pulled the cloth aside with trembling fingers. A gash ran along his ribs 4 inches long, jagged where the edges pulled apart, deep enough that she could see the white of deeper tissue, the pink of muscle beneath. Blood still seeped slow but steady, the kind of bleeding that meant he was still alive but wouldn't be for long. His chest rose with a shallow, wet breath. Then another. Alive. Barely. Margaret looked at the horse with its silver conchos, looked at the fine wool coat bunched beneath the man-mother-of-pearl buttons catching the light, looked at the calloused hands and the wedding ring tan line on his left finger, faded but visible. This man had money. Real money. And she had 73 cents to her name. She could leave. Should leave. This wasn't her problem, wasn't her responsibility. She had Tommy to think about, her own survival to manage. But she'd already seen too much death. Father in the mine collapse. Mother wasting away from consumption. Emily drowning in her own lungs while Margaret held her hand and couldn't save her. If she could save this one, this stranger, maybe the others would hurt a little less. Margaret Fletcher made her choice. She tore strips from her petticoat, the good one she'd been saving for church if she ever found one that would have her. The cotton ripped clean white against the blood on her fingers. She pressed the wadded fabric against the gash, leaning her weight into it, the way her mother had shown her years ago when her father cut his leg on the plow blade. The man groaned a sound pulled from somewhere deep and primal. His eyes stayed closed. "Don't you quit on me," Margaret muttered. "I'm not fixing to haul a corpse back to town." The bleeding slowed under pressure. Not stopped, but slowed. She needed to get him somewhere she could work. Somewhere with water and light and her mother's sewing kit. The mare stood patient while Margaret fashioned a travois from the saddle blanket. Thick wool large enough to hold a man's weight. She spread it on the ground, then rolled him onto it one push at a time, keeping pressure on the wound with her knee when her hands were busy. His head lolled. His breathing rattled. But he was on the blanket. Margaret tied the corners to the saddle horn, tested the knots twice, then took the mare's bridle and spoke soft words her grandmother had taught her. Horses could smell fear, could sense when a person was troubled. This one seemed to understand something was wrong. She stepped forward when Margaret asked, slow and careful, and the blanket slid across the grass with the man's weight dragging behind. The light was failing. The sky had turned from copper to purple, and the first stars were beginning to show over the eastern hills. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, that lonesome sound that made Margaret think of all the miles between here and home. She took the back way into town, avoiding the main street where people might see and ask questions she couldn't answer. The shed door scraped against packed earth as she shouldered it open. Getting him inside took everything she had left. The travois wouldn't fit through the doorway. She had to unhook it, grab the blanket's edges and pull. Her arms burned, her back screamed, his boots scraped furrows in the dirt floor, and his head bumped against the threshold with a sound that made her wince. But she got him inside, got him onto the horse blanket that served as her bed, got the door closed behind her. Margaret stood in the darkness, breathing hard sweat cooling on her neck despite the evening heat. Outside, the cricket chorus had started filling the night with their endless song. The mare. She'd nearly forgotten. She slipped back out, led the horse around to the back of the shed, where the shadows were deepest, tied her to a fence post, removed the saddle with shaking arms, gave her water from the trough. The street beyond was empty. Cedar Mill settling into evening routines. No one had seen. Back inside, the coal oil lamp took 3 matches to light. Her hands trembling now as urgency faded and reality set in. She filled her small kettle from the water bucket, set it on the makeshift stove, waited for the flame to catch and hold. The man lay where she'd left him, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His face had gone pale beneath the weathering lips, gray at the edges. Fever was coming. She could see it in the sweat beading on his forehead, feel it in the heat rising from his skin when she pressed her palm to his cheek. "Lord," she prayed silently, "I don't know who this man is or why you put him in my path, but I reckon you had your reasons. Help me do right by him." The water boiled. Margaret poured some into her tin basin, let it cool enough to touch. She knelt beside him and cut away his shirt with her sewing scissors. Good wool ruined now, soaked through with blood and creek water. The wound looked worse in lamplight. That jagged tear along his ribs' edges ragged where limestone had ripped through flesh. Deep enough to see muscle, to see the way tissue separated when it shouldn't. But no bone showing, no organs visible. He'd been lucky, if you could call this lucky. Margaret cleaned the wound with boiled water and strips of clean cloth. The man's body jerked with each touch, sounds escaping his throat that weren't quite words. She worked steadily, methodically, her mother's voice guiding her hands through memory. "Infection's what kills Maggie, girl. Clean it good even when they holler." She crushed yarrow leaves between her fingers, mixed them with a little water to make a paste, packed it into the gash the way she'd seen her mother do 100 times. Then bandages strips of her ruined petticoat wrapped tight around his torso. When she finished, her hands were steady again. Work had that effect on her, always had. The doing of things, the practical application of skill, steadied her when fear and uncertainty tried to take hold. She sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time since dragging him inside. His coat lay in the corner where she'd tossed it. Fine wool, mother-of-pearl buttons. The kind of coat a man wore when he wanted people to know he'd made something of himself. Margaret reached for it, found the inside pocket. A wallet. Leather soft with age and use. $17 in paper currency. More money than she'd held in her hands since leaving Pennsylvania. And a photograph. A daguerreotype in a small leather case. A woman's face stared back at her. Handsome, rather than pretty, with serious eyes and gray hair pulled back in a severe style. Wife-mother. Someone who loved him, certainly. Someone who was probably looking for him right now. Margaret put the wallet back exactly as she'd found it, tucked it into the coat, set the coat aside. She didn't take a cent. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know in that moment, was that the man wasn't as unconscious as she thought. His eyes had opened once just briefly in that space between awareness and oblivion that fever and pain create. Long enough to see her count the money. Long enough to see her put it all back. Long enough to decide who she was. The fever came hard around midnight. He burned under her hands, skin dry and hot breath coming fast and shallow. He muttered words that didn't connect fragments of a life she didn't know. North pasture. Have to check. Catherine. I'm sorry. So sorry. Should have called Doc Hammond sooner. The baby. Sarah. Please. Margaret wrung out cloths in cool water, pressed them to his forehead, his neck, his wrists. The lamp flame guttered in drafts from the poorly fitted door. Outside, an owl called low and mournful, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She changed the compress, counted his breaths, listened to the night sounds filtering through gaps in the walls. Crickets, the owl, the distant yip of coyotes hunting in the hills. The hours crawled past. Margaret's eyes grew heavy, but she didn't dare sleep. Every time she started to drift, she thought of her mother sitting up with her father that winter. He'd taken pneumonia. 3 nights straight, her mother had sat in that chair by the fire, not sleeping, just watching, praying, waiting. "You don't leave folks alone in the dark," her mother had said. "That's when dying comes for them." So Margaret stayed her back against the rough wall, her hands near his shoulder, ready to feel if his breathing changed or his fever climbed higher. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, the man's eyes opened. Unfocused, fever bright, seeing something that wasn't there. He looked right at her through her, and his cracked lips moved. "Catherine, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Should have gotten Doc sooner. The baby. Sarah." His voice broke on the name. Margaret's hand stilled on his forehead. Catherine. Sarah. Not her. Someone else. Someone he'd lost. "Hush now," she said quietly. "You're safe. Rest." His eyes closed. The tension went out of his body. He slipped back into whatever darkness the fever had made for him. Margaret sat beside him as night stretched toward dawn, watching his face in the flickering lamplight, wondering who Catherine was and who Sarah had been, and whether either of them still walked this earth or waited for him in whatever came after. Dawn came gray and slow through the cracks in the shed walls. Margaret had dozed some time in the small hours, her back against rough wood, her hands still resting near the stranger's shoulder. She woke to roosters crowing across town and pale light creeping into her small shelter. The man was still breathing. She checked the bandage first. The bleeding had stopped the yarrow doing its work. His fever had dropped too. Not gone, but lower, and some color had returned to his face. He looked less like a corpse now, and more like a man who'd had a terrible night but might yet see another day. Margaret stretched stiffness from her neck and shoulders. Her whole body ached from sleeping upright, and her stomach had begun making noises that reminded her she hadn't eaten since yesterday's half-biscuit. She counted her money. 2 quarters from Mrs. Hensley, 2 dimes saved from last week, 3 pennies she'd found in the street outside the saloon, 73 cents. The man needed medicine, real medicine, not creek bank remedies. She'd been rationing what little she had for 5 days, making do with yarrow and feverfew while his fever raged. Carbolic acid to fight infection, laudanum for the pain that would hit hard once he fully woke. Margaret gathered the coins into her palm, tucked them into her apron pocket, whispered a prayer that the Lord would watch over this stranger while she was gone, then slipped out into the morning. The apothecary smelled of camphor and dust and something bitter underneath. Medicine smells, her mother would have called them. Mr. Pruitt stood behind the counter, a thin man with spectacles perched on a nose that seemed too small for his face. Glass jars lined the shelves behind him, amber and green and clear, filled with powders and liquids Margaret couldn't name. She approached the counter, her boots loud on the worn wooden floor. "Miss Fletcher?" His voice carried no warmth but no judgment either, just acknowledgment of fact. "You're out early." "Yes, sir. I'm needing some carbolic acid and laudanum, small bottles of each." His eyebrows lifted a fraction behind those thick spectacles. "That's a particular combination. Treating something serious." Margaret kept her face still. She'd learned that trick from watching her mother deal with nosy neighbors back home. "Found a drifter out by the creek 5 days ago, took a bad fall. Figured Christian Charity called for doing what I could. Charitable thing would be bringing him to Doc Hammond. I reckon Doc Hammond charges $2 just to look at a man. I've got 73 cents to my name." Mr. Pruitt paused his hand on a brown glass bottle. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite sympathy, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. "Carbolic acid 25 cents, laudanum 40. He set both bottles on the counter. "That's 65 total." Margaret reached into her apron pocket, drew out the coins, laid them on the worn wood one by one. 2 quarters side by side, 2 dimes below them, 3 pennies in a row at the bottom. 65 cents crossed the counter. 8 cents would be left. 8 cents between her and nothing at all. Mr. Pruitt swept the money into his hand, dropped it into the till with a small rattle. He wrapped the bottles in brown paper, tied the package with string. "Christian Charity is a fine thing, Miss Fletcher." His voice was careful, measured. "But a woman alone ought to be cautious about who she takes in. There's folks in this world who'd take advantage of a kind heart." "I'm always cautious, Mr. Pruitt. Learned that lesson the hard way." She walked out into the morning sun, the package clutched against her chest. As she passed the general store, she heard voices through the open door. 2 men talking their words, carrying in the quiet morning air. "Been 5 days now. Henry's got every hand out looking. Brennan, James Brennan. Lord have mercy." Margaret slowed, not quite stopping, but her feet lost some of their urgency. "Richest rancher in 3 counties. 12,000 acres, 500 head, 20 families depending on those wages. There's a reward, $20 for information, 50 if found alive." $50. More than 3 months' wages. More than Margaret had seen at one time in her entire life. 12,000 acres, 500 head of cattle, richest rancher. Margaret thought of the silver conchos, the $17, the fine wool coat, the mother-of-pearl buttons, and she'd been hiding him in her shed. Her heart started beating faster, not from exertion, but from the slow dawn of understanding what she'd done without meaning to. The shed door stuck on its hinges when she pushed it open. The smell hit her first, sweat and blood and the close air of a space too small for secrets. Then movement. A sound. The scrape of fabric against wood. He was sitting up. The stranger had pushed himself against the wall, his face gray with effort, one hand pressed to his bandaged side. His eyes were open. Clear now, the fever haze burned away, fixed on the door. On her. For a long moment neither of them moved. Morning light fell between them, bright and sharp with floating dust. "Where am I?" His voice came out rough, scraped raw, like he'd been gargling gravel. He swallowed, tried again. "What is this place?" Margaret stepped inside, closed the door behind her. "My place, such as it is. Edge of town behind the livery." His gaze traveled the small space. The horse blanket on the dirt floor. The cracked mirror in the corner. The trunk that held everything she owned. Something flickered in his eyes. Understanding, maybe. Or surprise. "Who are you?" he asked. "Margaret Fletcher." She set the package on the trunk, began unwrapping it. "Who are you?" A pause. She felt him weighing the question, deciding what to give. "Cole." Margaret looked up. "Just Cole." Another pause. Longer this time. His jaw tightened, muscle working beneath stubble. "Just Cole. For now." She held his gaze for 3 heartbeats, then turned back to the package, pulling out bottles, setting them in a row on the trunk lid. "Well, just Cole. You were in bad way when I found you. Gash along your ribs. Deep, but clean enough. I don't reckon any organs got hit. You lost considerable blood, though." "How long have I been here?" "Since 5 days ago. Your fever broke few hours back." Cole looked down at the bandages wrapped around his torso, touched them gingerly, winced. "You did this?" "The bandaging. My mother was a midwife back in Pennsylvania. She taught me enough to be useful." He raised his eyes to hers. Something in his expression had shifted. Reassessment, maybe, or surprise that went deeper than surface acknowledgement. "Thank you. For the trouble. For the medicine." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for payment." "I know." He took a breath. "That's why I'm offering." She reached for the tin cup, filled it from the water bucket, held it out to him. Their fingers didn't touch when he took it. "Drink that. You need fluids. Fever took a lot out of you." He drank. She watched his throat work, watched the way his hand trembled slightly holding the cup. Weaker than he wanted to show, hurting more than he'd admit. When the cup was empty, she took it back, refilled it, set it within his reach on the dirt floor. "The carbolic acid needs to go on the wound. It'll sting something fierce. I've had worse." "I doubt that considerably." Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It didn't quite make it to his eyes. Margaret knelt beside him, unwrapping the bandages with careful hands. The wound looked better than she'd feared. Still angry, still raw, but the edges had started to close. No red streaks running from it. No smell of rot. She uncapped the carbolic acid, poured it onto a clean cloth. "Ready." Cole gripped the horse blanket beneath him. "Go ahead." She pressed the cloth to the wound. His whole body went rigid. The tendons in his neck stood out like ropes, and a sound escaped through his clenched teeth that wasn't quite a groan. But he didn't pull away, didn't cry out. Margaret counted to 10, lifted the cloth, applied fresh bandages, wrapping them tight. Done. Cole released a breath he'd been holding. His face had gone gray again, sheened with fresh sweat. "Thank you." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, rose to her feet. "There's broth warming on the stove. Bone broth. Not much, but it'll help build your strength back. You've done enough already, more than enough. I'll be the judge of that." She moved to the small stove where a pot sat over low flame. The broth was thin bones begged from the butcher behind the hotel, boiled down with a little salt, but it was hot and nourishing. She ladled some into a tin bowl, carried it to him, pressed it into his hands before he could refuse. Cole looked at the bowl, at her, at the shed around them. "Why?" he asked quietly. "You don't know me, don't owe me a blessed thing. Why help?" Margaret stood over him, arms crossed. "I found you dying in a creek. Didn't seem right to leave you there. Some folks would have." "I ain't some folks." She turned away, busied herself with the medicine bottles, gave him privacy to eat. Behind her she heard the soft sound of him drinking the broth, the tin bowl settling on the dirt floor. Then his voice quieter than before. "The coat. My wallet's in the inside pocket." Margaret stiffened. "You looked through it. I know you did. Anyone would." A pause. "But the money's still there. All $17. She didn't turn around. Her hands stayed busy arranging bottles that didn't need arranging. "I'm not a thief, Mr. Cole." "I know. That's exactly what I'm trying to say." Another pause. Longer. "Thank you for that, too." Margaret finally looked at him. He was watching her with those tired eyes, the bowl empty in his lap. "Get some rest. The laudanum will help with pain, but sleep will do more." She measured out a careful dose into the tin cup, handed it to him. Cole drank it without argument, settled back against the wall, his eyes already growing heavy. "Margaret Fletcher," he murmured the drug, pulling him toward sleep. "I won't forget that name. You do that." She watched him drift into drugged sleep, his breathing evening out the lines of pain softening in his face. Then she sat down on her trunk and counted what remained. 8 cents, a half-full bottle of carbolic acid. A stranger who owed her his life and offered money she wouldn't take. And somewhere out there, someone named Catherine was waiting for news of a man who'd never come home. Margaret Fletcher didn't know it yet, but her decision to save this stranger's life had set in motion events that would change everything. The question wasn't whether she'd made the right choice. The question was whether she'd survive the consequences. 3 days changed the rhythm of Margaret Fletcher's life in ways she couldn't have predicted. She measured time now by the changing of bandages, the warming of broth, the slow return of color to the stranger's face. 3 days of sharing a space built for one of learning when he slept and when he woke, of conversations that circled around the things neither of them said. On the morning of the 3rd day, Cole sat up without help. Margaret watched from the doorway, a steaming bowl in her hands, as he pushed himself upright against the wall. His jaw clenched tight. The muscles in his arms trembled with effort. But he made it. And when he was settled, he looked at her with something in his eyes that wasn't quite pride, but lived close by. "Getting stronger," she said. "Slower than I'd like. You had a hole in your side 3 days ago. Slow is how it's supposed to go." She crossed the small space, handed him the bowl. Their fingers brushed, this time brief and accidental, both of them pulling back like touching burned. "My grandmother used to say the Lord didn't make oak trees in a day, and he won't mend a stubborn man any faster." Cole took the bowl. His hands were steadier today, no tremor when he lifted it to his lips. "Bone broth again. It's what I've got. You want fancy, you'll have to find yourself a hotel." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face, genuine this time, reaching his eyes for the first time since she'd found him. "This is fine. Better than fine." Margaret moved to the corner where she'd piled the dirty bandages, began sorting them for washing. Some could be boiled clean and used again. Others were too far gone stiff with dried blood that had turned the color of rust. Outside she could hear Cedar Mill coming awake, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against iron, a dog barking somewhere down the street, children's voices raised in some game or argument, the ordinary sounds of ordinary life going on while she hid a stranger in her shed. "Where'd you learn to make broth like this?" Cole asked between sips. "Nowhere special. You learn or you go hungry." "That a Pennsylvania philosophy?" Margaret's hands stilled on the fabric. She looked at him over her shoulder. "How do you know I'm from Pennsylvania?" "Your accent, the way you flatten certain words, and you mentioned your mother was a midwife back there." He set the empty bowl aside. I've done business with men from Pittsburgh. They talk the same way." Business. The word hung in the air like smoke. Margaret filed it away with the other clues: the fine coat, the silver conchos, the $17 he carried like pocket change. "Allentown," she said, turning back to the bandages. "Small town north of Philadelphia. Coal country, though my people weren't miners. My father farmed what land we had. My mother delivered babies and tended the sick." "What brought you all the way to Texas?" The question landed soft, but Margaret felt its weight. She folded a bandage, set it aside, reached for another. "A man." Silence from behind her. "The one who never showed." More silence. Then so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "I was awake for that conversation. Fever doesn't always mean a body can't hear." Margaret's fingers pressed hard into the fabric. She thought of the words she'd muttered in the dark, the frustrations she'd let slip when she thought she was alone. Heat crept up her neck. "His name was William Barrett." She said the words coming out flat the way she'd practiced saying them so they wouldn't crack. "We wrote letters for 6 months. Started when I answered an advertisement in the newspaper." Fold. Set aside. Reach. "He wrote nice letters. Real nice. Said he had a ranch outside of town. Said he was building a house with his own hands. Said he wanted a wife who wasn't afraid of work and wasn't looking for fancy things." Her hands kept moving the rhythm, steadying her, giving her something to hold on to. "He sent me $40 for the train ticket. That was more money than I'd seen at one time in my whole life. And he sent me a marriage certificate already signed on his end. Said it would make things proper when I arrived." The last bandage. Margaret folded it with care, smoothing every crease. "I sold everything I owned. Quit my job at the textile mill. Said goodbye to neighbors I'd known since I was in pinafores." She paused, her throat tight, but pushed through. "Got on a train and rode for 4 days, watching the country change outside the window, thinking about apple trees and gardens and children someday." She turned to face him. He wasn't there. When I stepped off that stage, there was no one waiting. No William Barrett, no ranch, no house. Nobody in Cedar Mill had ever heard of him. Her voice stayed level, but her hands had curled into fists at her sides. "Either he never existed at all, or he took one look at me getting off that stage and decided he'd made a mistake. I reckon I'll never know which." Cole had stopped eating. The bowl sat forgotten on the dirt floor beside him. "How long ago?" 3 weeks come Sunday. "And you've been here since in this shed?" "Old Tom lets me use it for mucking out his stalls. I take in laundry when folks will hire me. It's not much, but it's honest work. And it's mine." She waited for what usually came next. The head tilt of pity, the clicking of tongue, the offer of hollow comfort. She'd gotten good at bracing for it. But Cole just looked at her, really looked the way you look at something you're trying to understand. "What do you figure to do?" "Work. Save what I can. Move on eventually, I suppose. Find somewhere folks don't know I got left at the station like a trunk nobody came to claim." The words came out harder than she meant. A thin smile followed, not humor exactly, but something that wore the same clothes. "My mama used to say the Lord doesn't waste pain. Everything hard we go through, He uses to make us ready for what comes next." She shrugged. "I'm still waiting to see what that might be." Cole didn't smile back. His eyes traveled the shed, taking inventory of her life, measuring its size. The horse blanket she'd given up for him. The cracked mirror. The trunk with its tarnished corners. "You spent your last money on medicine for me." Not a question. Margaret didn't answer. "The carbolic acid. The laudanum. You came back from the apothecary with nothing else. No food for yourself. No supplies. Just the medicine I needed. You were hurting. You didn't even know my name." "What difference does a name make? You were dying. I could help. That's what decent folks do." Cole was quiet for a long spell. He picked up the bowl again, but didn't drink from it, just held it, turning it in his hands like he was looking for something written on its surface. "I have a ranch," he said finally, "north of here. Cattle operation mostly." Margaret's hands stilled. 12,000 acres, 500 head, 20 men on the payroll, give or take. The numbers hung in the air. 12,000 acres. Margaret thought of the $17 in his wallet, thought of the silver conchos on his saddle, thought of the bone broth she'd been feeding him, made from scraps the butcher threw out for dogs. I rode out 4 days ago to check the north pasture, alone. His jaw tightened. Foolish habit. My foreman tells me so every time. The mare spooked at something, threw me into the rocks. After that, things go hazy. 12,000 acres. Margaret's mouth had gone dry. So when you said just Cole, I meant Cole Brennan. James Cole Brennan. If you believe what folks say, though, I generally don't put much stock in what folks say. The shed felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer. Margaret was aware of every crack in the wood, every patch on her dress, every callus on her work-worn hands. Why didn't you tell me straight off? Because you didn't ask. Because you looked at me and saw a man who needed help, not a rancher with a name and a bank account. His voice dropped. Do you have any notion how rare that is, to have somebody see you plain without all the rest of it getting in the way? Margaret stared at him. Outside, the church bell began to ring. Noon already. The day half gone while she stood here having her world turned sideways. I saw $17 in your wallet. That's not just a man. And you didn't take it, not 1 cent. The words landed between them like something heavy dropped from a height. I told you before, I'm not a thief. I know. That's what I keep trying to say. He leaned forward, wincing at the pull in his side. In 37 years of living, I've met a considerable number of people who wanted something from me. Money favors connections to the right folks. You're the first person in longer than I can remember who wanted nothing but to see me breathing. Margaret didn't know what to say to that. Her mouth opened closed. She turned away, busying herself with the coal oil stove, checking a flame that didn't need checking. It doesn't change anything. You still needed help. I still gave it. That's all there is to it. It changes everything. She heard him shift behind her, the rustle of the blanket, a sharp intake of breath as movement pulled at his wound. Margaret? She didn't turn around. I'm going to find a way to repay what you've done. Not with money, I can see plain enough that won't work. But somehow. Some way that matters. Margaret stared at the stove flame, watched it dance behind the sooty glass. Get some rest, Mr. Brennan. You're still healing. Cole. A pause. Mr. Brennan's what folks call my father's memory. I'm Cole. Fair enough. For now. She heard him settle back against the wall, heard his breathing slow as the laudanum she'd given him earlier pulled him toward sleep. Only when she was certain he was unconscious did Margaret allow herself to sit. She lowered herself onto the trunk, her legs suddenly unsteady, and pressed her hands flat against her thighs. 12,000 acres. The richest rancher in 3 counties, maybe more. Sleeping on her horse blanket, eating broth she'd made from scraps, owing her his life. And somewhere out there his people were looking for him, asking questions, offering money for information. How long before the truth came knocking at her door? The afternoon heat pressed down on Cedar Mill like a weight. Margaret walked to the general store, a list in her pocket, and 8 cents in her hand, enough for salt, and maybe a handful of cornmeal if Mr. Dawson felt charitable. The store was dim after the bright sunlight, cool in the way thick walls and high ceilings provided. Barrels of flour lined one wall, bins of nails another. The smell of coffee beans and leather and the particular mustiness of goods that had traveled far to reach this little town. 2 women stood near the counter, their conversation stopping dead when Margaret entered. Mrs. Hensley and Mrs. Doyle, pillars of the Cedar Mill Ladies' Society, their dresses crisp despite the heat, their judgment crisper still. Margaret kept her eyes forward, moved toward the salt barrel at the back of the store. The whispers started before she was halfway there. That's her. The mail-order bride. Still here after 3 weeks. You'd think she'd have the decency to move on. I heard she's got a man in that shed now, some drifter she picked up. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she didn't slow, didn't acknowledge she'd heard. She was measuring salt into a small cloth bag when the voice came from behind her, smooth and educated and familiar in a way that made her blood run cold. Margaret Fletcher. What a pleasant surprise. She turned. The man standing 3 feet away wore a suit despite the heat, a pocket watch chain gleaming against his vest. Dark hair slicked back, mustache trimmed with precision, handsome in a calculated way with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. William Barrett. You. The word came out barely a whisper. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear, though his posture remained that of a concerned gentleman addressing a lady he'd been worried about. My dear Miss Fletcher, I've been so concerned. When I arrived at the station and you weren't there, I feared the worst. Mrs. Hensley and Mrs. Doyle were watching now, their conversation forgotten in favor of this more interesting drama. Margaret's hands gripped the cloth bag tight enough that salt spilled between her fingers. You're lying. You were never at that station. Nobody in Cedar Mill has ever heard of William Barrett. His smile didn't waver. Actually, my name is William Bradford. Barrett was a convenience, a business name, you might say. He took another step close enough now that she could smell bay rum and something underneath it, something sour. And you're right. I was never coming to that station. But here's what's interesting, Margaret. You're still here, after 3 weeks, making quite a life for yourself, I see. Stay away from me. I've built a very successful business, he continued, voice dropping even lower. 18 women, 18 marriages, 18 relocations. Most of them move on quietly, find work elsewhere, disappear into the great wide country, and never trouble me again. His eyes cold and flat as river stones fixed on hers. But you stayed. You made friends. That stable owner who lets you live in his shed. That sick man you're hiding. Margaret's breath caught. Oh yes, small towns talk, and I make it my business to know where my former clients end up. Can't have loose ends, you understand. Bad for business. What do you want? Barrett glanced around, ensuring they were still not overheard, then leaned in close enough that his breath touched her ear. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take that child you're hiding, yes, I know about the boy too, and you're going to leave Cedar Mill. Tonight. Quietly. No goodbyes, no explanations. Just gone. Or what? His smile widened, showing teeth. Or I tell Sheriff Dawson that you and your bastard child are running a confidence scheme, seducing injured ranchers when they're vulnerable, trapping them for their money. I have letters, Margaret, bank records, 17 other women who'll swear to my good character if asked. He straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with casual precision. Who do you think they'll believe, a respected businessman from Philadelphia with impeccable credentials, or a desperate mail-order bride living in a shed behind a stable? Margaret's vision had started to narrow, her breath coming short. I saved that man's life. I didn't trap anyone. Doesn't matter what's true, my dear. Only matters what people believe. And small-town Texas folks, they do love a good scandal about a fallen woman. He tipped his hat, the gesture almost friendly. You have until tomorrow morning. Be gone, or I'll destroy whatever pitiful little life you've managed to scrape together here. And that man you're hiding, when his people find out you've been keeping him from them for days, well, I imagine there are laws about that sort of thing. He walked past her toward the door, pausing only to tip his hat to Mrs. Hensley and Mrs. Doyle. Ladies, lovely to see Cedar Mill taking care of those less fortunate. True Christian charity. As Barrett reached the door, Margaret caught a glimpse of someone waiting outside. A large man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had seen too much violence and learned to like it. Their eyes met briefly through the window, and something cold slithered down Margaret's spine. Barrett joined the man, spoke quietly. The large man's gaze never left Margaret. Then they both walked away toward the saloon. Mrs. Hensley leaned toward Mrs. Doyle, lowering her voice, but not enough. That's Silas Crow. Works for Mr. Bradford. Heard he used to be an enforcer for the railroad. Rough type. The bell above the door jangled as he left. Margaret stood frozen, the salt bag forgotten in her trembling hands. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. Run and prove him right. Stay and watch him destroy everything. Fight with what? She had no money, no allies, no proof of anything except her own desperation. Mrs. Hensley's voice cut through the fog. "Miss Fletcher, are you quite all right? You've gone pale." Margaret forced her legs to move forced words past her tight throat. "I'm fine, just the heat." She set the salt on the counter, counted out 3 cents with shaking hands, and walked out into the brutal afternoon sun. Tommy was waiting behind the stable, his thin face creased with worry beyond his 9 years. "Aunt Maggie, you look like you've seen a ghost." She pulled him close, her hands gripping his shoulders perhaps too tight. "We might need to leave Tommy, soon." "But Mr. Brennan's job offer—" "It doesn't matter." Her voice came out harsher than she intended. "Barrett found us." Tommy's eyes went wide, fear replacing worry. "The bad man from the letters. He's here. He's here. And he wants us gone." She looked down at the boy who'd become her responsibility, her purpose, the reason she kept breathing when everything else had been taken away. 9 years old, and he'd already lost more than most people lose in a lifetime. "Pack your things tonight. Just what you can carry. We might have to leave fast." "Where will we go?" Margaret had no answer for that. She'd come to Texas because it was as far as $40 would take her. There was nowhere left to run. That evening, as purple dusk settled over the hills and the first stars appeared above the eastern horizon, Margaret sat in the shed with Cole sleeping fitfully on the horse blanket and Tommy curled in the corner with her grandmother's Bible clutched to his chest. She pulled out the marriage certificate, unfolded it for what must have been the 100th time, and stared at William Barrett's signature, or William Bradford's, or whoever he really was. The man who'd stolen $40 and 6 months of hope, who'd sent her 2,000 miles to a town where he never intended to be, who was now threatening to destroy the fragile new life she'd barely begun to build. Margaret traced the signature with her thumb, remembering how she'd believed in those letters, in those promises of apple trees and porches and a place to belong. She'd been a fool, and now Tommy would pay for her foolishness. A sound from the corner made her look up. Cole's eyes were open, watching her in the dim lamplight. "Can't sleep." His voice was rough but stronger than it had been. "Too much thinking." "About Barrett." She stiffened. "Fever doesn't mean a body can't hear," he said, echoing her earlier words back to her. "I heard you talking to the boy, heard the fear in your voice." Margaret folded the certificate, started to tuck it away, but Cole spoke again. "Don't run. You don't understand. Then help me understand." And because she was tired, because fear had worn down her defenses, because this man had trusted her with his life, and maybe that earned him some truth in return, Margaret told him everything, about Emily dying, about Tommy having nowhere to go, about the advertisement that promised children welcome, about 6 months of letters building a future that never existed, about Barrett showing up today with threats and leverage and the power to destroy her. Cole listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, silence filled the shed, broken only by Tommy's soft breathing and the distant sound of night birds calling. "Tomorrow," Cole said finally, "a man named Henry Cooper will come looking for me. He's my foreman, loyal as they come. When he arrives, you're going to tell him everything you just told me. He won't believe me. He'll believe me, and I'll tell him you saved my life, that you're under my protection, that anyone who threatens you threatens me. Mr. Brennan, Cole, you can't fight my battles." "Can't I?" Something hard entered his voice, something that reminded her he'd built an empire out of dirt and determination. This Barrett or Bradford or whatever he calls himself, he made a mistake coming here, made a mistake thinking he could threaten someone under my roof. This shed isn't your roof. You're splitting hairs, and you're wrong besides. The moment you pulled me out of that creek, the moment you spent your last coins on medicine for a stranger, you became my responsibility, whether you like it or not. Margaret shook her head, but something in her chest had loosened just slightly. "Why?" The question came out small. "Why do you care?" Cole was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I had a wife once, Catherine, and a daughter, Sarah. They died 8 years ago. Fever took them both within a week." Margaret's throat tightened. I built this ranch for them. Every acre, every fence post. Thought if I worked hard enough, provided well enough, it would keep them safe." He looked at her. "Didn't work. And after they died, I kept building anyway. Kept working. Because stopping meant remembering what I'd lost." He shifted, wincing at the pull in his side. "You asked why I care. Because for 8 years I've been surviving, not living. Going through motions. And then you, a woman with every reason to walk away, every reason to protect yourself. You stayed. You fought. You gave everything you had to save a stranger." His voice dropped. "That's the kind of person worth protecting. That's the kind of person who reminds me why any of this matters." Margaret couldn't speak, couldn't move. The lamplight flickered between them, casting shadows that danced on the rough walls. "So no," Cole said. "You're not running. You're not letting this man win. Tomorrow when Henry comes, we end this. Together." But tomorrow would bring more than Henry Cooper. Tomorrow would bring truth and consequences and a reckoning that neither of them saw coming. Outside, in a room above the saloon, William Bradford sat at a small desk and composed a telegram. His partner Silas Crow sat in the corner cleaning his pistol, a cold smile on his scarred face. Crow, unlike Bradford, had no patience for threats and negotiations. Crow preferred more direct solutions, if Margaret Fletcher wouldn't leave quietly well. Accidents happened on the frontier. People disappeared, and 9-year-old boys made excellent leverage. Bradford sealed the telegram, smiled to himself, and poured another whiskey. Tomorrow would be interesting indeed. In the shed, Margaret finally let herself believe just for a moment that maybe she didn't have to run, that maybe impossibly she'd found someone who would stand with her instead of abandoning her. She looked at Cole, at Tommy sleeping in the corner, at the 8 cents sitting on her trunk, and the marriage certificate with its worthless signature. Tomorrow would change everything. She just didn't know how much. The night deepened. Stars wheeled overhead. And Cedar Mill slept unaware that the morning would bring revelations and violence and choices that would alter the course of multiple lives. Margaret Fletcher had come to Texas chasing a promise that didn't exist. She'd found instead a wounded rancher, a threatening con man, and a truth she was only beginning to understand. Some rescues save lives. Others save souls. She was about to discover which kind she'd performed. Dawn broke over Cedar Mill with a sky the color of old copper streaked with clouds that promised heat before noon. Margaret had not slept. She'd sat by the small window watching darkness give way to gray, then gray to gold, knowing that this day would bring change, whether she was ready or not. Cole had slept fitly, the laudanum wearing off in the small hours, leaving him restless with pain and the frustration of a man accustomed to action forced into stillness. Tommy stirred in his corner, clutching the Bible, his young face peaceful in a way it never was when waking. The sound of hoofbeats broke the morning quiet. Margaret moved to the door, peered through a crack in the wood. A rider approached from the north road, an older man on a bay gelding moving with the purposeful pace of someone who'd been searching too long and wouldn't stop until he found what he was looking for. "He's here," she said quietly. Cole pushed himself up, ignoring the sharp intake of breath the movement cost him. "Henry, let him in." Margaret opened the door as the rider dismounted. Up close, she could see the toll the search had taken. Gray hair beneath a dust-covered hat, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, deep lines carved by worry and exhaustion. This was a man who'd ridden hard and long, driven by loyalty that went deeper than wages. "Miss Fletcher," his voice was rough, uncertain. "Mr. Cooper, please, come in." Henry stepped into the shed, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Then he saw Cole, and something in the old cowboy's face crumbled. "Boss?" The word came out broken. "Dear God, we thought you were dead." Not quite, though it was close. Henry crossed the space in 3 strides, dropped to one knee beside Cole, his weathered hands moving over him as if to verify he was real and whole and breathing. 5 days. 5 days we've been looking. Found the mare 2 days ago at Meyer's place, still saddled, blood on the blanket. We feared—" his voice caught. What happened? Mare spooked, threw me into the rocks by Cypress Creek. After that things went dark until I woke up here. Cole nodded toward Margaret. Miss Fletcher found me, pulled me out, kept me alive when I had no business surviving. Henry turned to Margaret and she saw tears tracking through the dust on his face. Ma'am, I don't have words. We've been searching every canyon, every creek, every place a man might fall. The whole county's been out looking. I did what anyone would do. No, ma'am. You did what most folks wouldn't. Henry rose, removed his hat. There's a reward, $50. It's yours by right. Margaret's jaw tightened. I don't want reward money. Miss Fletcher has been taking care of me for 5 days, Cole said, on nothing but yarrow and bone broth and sheer determination. She spent her last coins on medicine, refused payment, refused everything except the chance to do what was right. Henry studied Margaret with the assessing gaze of a man who'd spent decades judging character in hard country. Then you're a rare woman, Miss Fletcher, and Cole Brennan doesn't forget debts. The name hung in the air. Cole Brennan. Not just Cole. The richest rancher in 3 counties. The man whose disappearance had mobilized search parties and offered rewards and made widows fear for their livelihoods. Margaret had known, of course, had overheard the conversations, but hearing it spoken plain in the presence of his foreman made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Henry, Cole said, I need you to do something for me. Anything, boss. There's a man in town, William Bradford, calls himself Barrett sometimes. He's been threatening Miss Fletcher, trying to run her out of Cedar Mill. Henry's expression hardened. What kind of threats? Cole told him. About the mail-order bride scheme, about the 18 women, about Barrett showing up yesterday with leverage and malice, about Tommy, the 9-year-old boy Margaret was protecting. With each detail, Henry's face grew darker. Where's this Bradford now? Room above the saloon, most like, Margaret said quietly. That's where men with money stay. Henry settled his hat back on his head with deliberate precision. I'll have Sheriff Dawson pay him a visit, see what he has to say about fraud and extortion. Be careful, Cole warned. Man like that doesn't work alone, and he's had practice at this. I've been handling trouble since before you were born, boss. I know how to deal with snakes. Henry moved toward the door, then paused. The ranch needs you. Ruth's been managing the house, but the men need to see you're alive, need to know things are going to be all right. I know. Give me 2 more days to get my feet under me. Henry nodded, then looked back at Margaret. Whatever you need, Miss Fletcher, food supplies, protection, you ask. Cole Brennan takes care of his own, and you're his own now whether you planned on it or not. He left the sound of hoofbeats fading toward town. Margaret sank onto her trunk, her legs suddenly unsteady. It started, she said. It has. And it'll end the way it should, with Barrett in chains and you safe. But Margaret had learned not to trust promises, and something in her bones told her this wouldn't end as simply as Cole believed. She was right. By noon, the entire town knew that Cole Brennan had been found alive, hidden for 5 days by the mail-order bride nobody wanted. By early afternoon, the whispers had evolved into speculation. By evening, they'd transformed into scandal. Mrs. Hensley held court at the general store, her voice carrying the authority of Cedar Mill's self-appointed moral guardian. 5 days she kept him there, alone, in that shed, and we're supposed to believe nothing improper occurred. She was nursing him back to health, Mr. Dawson offered weakly. A woman alone with a man, no chaperone, no oversight. It's unseemly at best, calculated at worst. Mrs. Doyle leaned in, lowering her voice just enough to make listeners lean closer. I heard from Sarah Mitchell, who heard from Tom at the livery, that there's a child, a boy. Fletcher's been hiding him this whole time. Hiding a child. Why? Because it's probably hers. Probably came to Texas already ruined, looking to trap some unsuspecting man with a story about being a mail-order bride. Margaret heard about the gossip from old Tom, who delivered the news with gruff sympathy. Don't let 'em get to you, miss. Small minds need small targets. But the damage was done. When Margaret walked to the well for water, conversation stopped. When she entered the general store, women turned their backs. The town had made its judgment, and Margaret Fletcher had been found wanting. Tommy felt it too. Children picked up what their parents whispered. At the stable where he'd been helping Tom, two boys his age threw rocks and called him bastard until old Tom ran them off with a broom. That evening, Margaret sat with Cole and told him about the town's verdict. "They think I trapped you. Think Tommy's mine. Think I came here to run some kind of confidence scheme. Let them think what they want. Easy for you to say. You're Cole Brennan. They'll forgive you anything. But me, I'm just the woman nobody wanted." Cole grabbed her hand, his grip stronger than it had been even that morning. "Listen to me. In 2 days, I'll be strong enough to ride. We'll go to the ranch, you and Tommy both. I'll make it official. Housekeeper position, $15 a month, room and board. The gossip will only get worse. Then we give them something real to gossip about." Margaret pulled her hand away. "What does that mean?" But before Cole could answer, the door burst open. Old Tom stood there breathing hard, his weathered face creased with worry. "Miss Fletcher, the boy, Tommy, he's gone." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "Came to find him for supper. He wasn't in the stable, wasn't anywhere. Found this on the ground where he'd been working." He held out Tommy's grandmother's Bible, the cover scuffed pages bent like it had been dropped in struggle. Margaret took it with shaking hands. Inside the front cover, pressed between pages, was a note written in elegant script. "The boy is safe. For now. You want him back, you leave Cedar Mill tonight. Alone. No law, no rancher. Just you. Midnight. North Road 2 miles out. Come alone, or the boy suffers for your disobedience. Bradford." The note fell from Margaret's fingers. Cole was on his feet despite the pain, despite the bandages, despite everything. "Henry. We need Henry and every man he can gather." "No." Margaret's voice came out flat dead. "The note says come alone. If I bring anyone, he'll hurt Tommy. If you go alone, he'll hurt you both. Men like Bradford don't negotiate. They take what they want and leave bodies behind." "He's 9 years old." Margaret looked at Cole, her eyes dry but burning. "He's all I have left of my sister. If something happens to him because of me, because of my choices, I'll never—" She couldn't finish. Cole gripped her shoulders. "We do this smart. You go. But you won't be alone. Henry and I will follow at a distance. When Bradford shows himself, we move, fast and final. You can barely walk." "I can ride, and I can shoot. That's all I need." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but Tommy's life hung in the balance, and she had no better plan. "All right, but if anything goes wrong, if Tommy gets hurt because of this—" "He won't, I give you my word." And despite everything, despite a lifetime of broken promises, Margaret believed him. The hours until midnight crawled past like wounded things. Henry arrived with 2 of his best men, both carrying rifles and the hard-eyed competence of cowboys who'd dealt with rustlers and worse. They made a plan. Margaret would walk the North Road alone, visible and vulnerable. The men would parallel her path through the scrub, staying low and quiet. When Bradford revealed himself, when they had eyes on Tommy, they'd move. Cole checked his pistol 3 times. His jaw set with the kind of determination Margaret had seen in men who'd made peace with violence when necessary. At 11:30 they set out. The night was moonless, stars providing the only light. The road stretched north from Cedar Mill like a pale ribbon through dark country. Margaret walked alone, her footsteps loud in the silence, every shadow holding potential threat. 2 miles felt like 20. She reached the designated spot, a bend in the road where mesquite clustered thick on both sides. Waited. Listened. Heard nothing but her own heartbeat and the distant call of a night bird. Then a voice from the darkness. "Very good, Margaret. You can follow instructions after all." Bradford stepped into the road, and he wasn't alone. Silas Crow emerged from the shadows behind him, a massive man with arms like fence posts and a face that had seen violence and embraced it. He held Tommy by the collar, the boy's face streaked with tears but his chin up, defiant even in terror. "Aunt Maggie." Tommy's voice cracked. "I'm sorry I tried to run, but—" Crow shook him once hard enough to rattle teeth. "Boy should learn when to keep quiet." Margaret took a step forward, hands raised to show she was unarmed. "Let him go. I'm here. I'll leave. Just let him go." Bradford smiled, and in the starlight his teeth looked too white, too sharp. "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple anymore. You see, I've been giving this situation considerable thought. The boy knows too much, and honestly, so do you. Loose ends, as I said before, bad for business." The pistol appeared in his hand like magic moonlight catching the barrel. "Crow will take the boy into the hills, make it look like he got lost, wandered off, tragic accident. And you, well, women disappear on the frontier all the time. Could be Indians, could be wild animals, could be anything really." Margaret's mouth went dry. "You'll hang for this. Sheriff Dawson will find 2 unfortunate victims of the wilderness. He'll investigate, of course. Proper procedure. But investigations take time, and I'll be in California by then, starting fresh with a new name and new opportunities." He raised the pistol, aimed it at Margaret's chest. "I want you to know this isn't personal. Just business. You should have run when you had the chance." The gunshot split the night, but it wasn't Bradford who fired. The bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him sideways, the pistol flying from his hand. He went down hard, screaming blood, black in the starlight. Cole Brennan stepped from the mesquite, his own pistol smoking his face carved from stone. "Federal offense," he said calmly. "Mail fraud, extortion, attempted murder. I'd say 20 years minimum if they don't hang you." Crow moved fast for a big man dragging Tommy backward, his own pistol appearing pressed to the boy's temple. "Nobody moves or the kid dies." Margaret's world narrowed to that gun, that barrel, that finger on the trigger. "Please," she whispered. "He's just a child." Should have thought of that before. Another gunshot, this one from the darkness to Crow's left. Henry Cooper's aim was true. The bullet took Crow in the meat of his gun arm. His pistol dropped. Tommy wrenched free and ran straight to Margaret, who caught him and held him like she'd never let go. Henry's men emerged from cover rifles trained on both Bradford and Crow. The violence was over in seconds, decisive and final as a lightning strike. Cole walked to Bradford, still lying in the road, clutching his shoulder. "You made a mistake coming to my town, threatening my people." "Your people," Bradford spat blood. "She's nobody, just another whore trying to—" Cole's boot caught him in the ribs, cutting off the words. "Sheriff Dawson's already been notified. Telegram went out to the federal marshal in Austin 2 hours ago. They're very interested in your business, Mr. Bradford. Seems you've got outstanding warrants in 3 states. Bradford's face went white. "How did you—" "I'm not just a rancher. I've got connections, resources, and I don't take kindly to men who hurt children and threaten women under my protection." He looked at Margaret, still holding Tommy, both of them shaking. "You all right?" "We are now." Sheriff Dawson arrived with deputies 20 minutes later, having been positioned in town, waiting for Henry's signal. They took Bradford and Crow into custody, both men bleeding but alive enough to face justice. The sheriff, a weathered man in his early 60s with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that had seen too much, approached Margaret. "Miss Fletcher, I need your statement. About the mail fraud, the threats, everything." Margaret told him. All of it. The letters, the $40, the 18 women, Barrett's threats in the general store, Tommy's kidnapping. When she finished, Dawson removed his hat. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. Town's been saying things, making judgments. We should have listened before condemning. Will he hang? Bradford Federal Court will decide. But mail fraud's a serious charge. Add in extortion, kidnapping, attempted murder." He settled his hat back on. "He'll spend the rest of his life in prison at minimum, more likely hang." He looked at Cole. "You did good tonight, Brennan. Saved lives. Caught a snake that's been slithering through too many towns for too long. Just protecting what's mine." Dawson's eyebrow raised slightly at that, but he said nothing, just tipped his hat and left with his prisoners. The ride back to town was quiet. Tommy fell asleep against Margaret's shoulder, exhausted by terror and relief. Henry and his men rode ahead, giving Cole and Margaret space. "Thank you," Margaret said finally, "for believing me, for helping. You saved my life. Seems only fair I return the favor." "We're even then." Cole was quiet for a moment, his horse walking steady beneath him despite his injury. "I don't want to be even, Margaret." She looked at him in the darkness. "What do you want? Come to the ranch. Both of you, not as housekeeper, not as employee, as family." Margaret's breath caught. "Cole? I know it's soon. I know you've got reasons not to trust promises, but I'm not Barrett. I'm not offering pretty words on paper. I'm offering real life, real work, real home." "Why, you barely know me." "I know you pulled a dying man from a creek when you could have walked away. I know you spent your last coins on medicine for a stranger. I know you walked into danger alone to save a child who wasn't even yours by blood." He shifted in the saddle, winced, continued anyway. "I know that in 8 years of surviving instead of living, you're the first person who's made me want to try again. To build something that matters. Not just land and cattle, but family. Home. The things I lost when Catherine and Sarah died." Margaret's eyes stung. "I'm broken, Cole. Barrett broke something in me. Made me afraid to trust, afraid to hope." "Then we're well matched. Catherine's death broke me too. Maybe we can be broken together. Maybe that's enough to start." They rode in silence for a while, the town lights appearing ahead, warm and welcoming in a way they hadn't been before. "I need to think," Margaret said finally. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands." But even as she said it, Margaret knew her answer. Knew it the moment Cole had stepped from the mesquite with his pistol drawn. The moment he'd risked his barely healed body to save her and Tommy. The moment he'd offered not rescue, but partnership. Some promises were worth believing in after all. 3 days later, Margaret Fletcher climbed into Henry Cooper's wagon with her trunk beside her and Tommy bouncing excitedly on the seat. Everything she owned fit in that trunk, same as it had when she arrived in Cedar Mill. But everything had changed. The road north wound through limestone hills dotted with live oak and juniper. Cedar waxwings darted between the trees, their calls sharp and bright in the morning air. The smell of sage rose from the warming earth, mixing with the leather scent of the wagon seat and the particular dusty sweetness of a Texas autumn beginning to hint at its arrival. Tommy pressed his face to the view, eyes wide. "Is it much farther, Mr. Cooper?" Henry smiled, the first real smile Margaret had seen on the old foreman's weathered face. "Just over this rise, son, just over this rise." The wagon crested the hill, and Henry pulled the horses to a stop. "There she is, Brennan Ranch." Margaret looked. The house stood white against green hills, 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides like arms waiting to embrace. Glass windows, real glass, caught the morning sun and threw it back at the sky. A red-painted barn sat to the left, solid and proud. Corrals fanned out behind it, and beyond them pastures rolled toward the horizon dotted with live oak and grazing cattle as far as the eye could see. 12,000 acres. The number had been words before. Now it pressed against her chest, heavy and real. She thought of the shed behind the livery, the cracked mirror, the horse blanket on the dirt floor, the 73 cents that had been all she had in the world. "Ready?" Henry asked. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. "Drive on." Cole met them on the porch steps, walking with barely a limp, now his movements careful but strong. Color had returned to his face, and when he saw Margaret step down from the wagon, something shifted in his expression that made her heart skip. "You came. I said I would. You said you'd think on it." Margaret looked at the house, at the glass windows and wide porch and rocking chairs arranged to catch the evening breeze. "I thought. This is my answer." Tommy was already exploring, running toward the barn with the boundless energy of a child who'd been confined too long. Henry followed him, calling something about horses and kittens in the loft. Cole stepped aside, gestured toward the front door. "Welcome to Brennan Ranch, Miss Fletcher. Let me show you around." The house smelled of lemon oil and wood smoke and something baking in the kitchen. Margaret followed Cole through the front door, her worn boots quiet on polished wooden floors. A parlor opened to the left, leather chairs softened by years of use, a fireplace swept clean, bookshelves lined with more volumes than Margaret had seen outside a lending library. Dining rooms through there. Cole nodded to the right. A long table of dark wood waited, dust motes drifting in the light from the windows. 8 chairs stood empty around it. Margaret wondered when anyone had last sat in them. Kitchen's at the back. That's Ruth Patterson's territory. She's been running this household since before I could grow a proper beard. She doesn't suffer fools, but she's got a good heart under the vinegar. They walked down a hallway lined with photographs. Men on horseback, cattle drives, a wedding portrait in a silver frame. Margaret's eyes lingered on that last one. A young man with dark hair stood beside a woman with serious eyes and gray hair pulled back in the same severe style as the daguerreotype Margaret had seen in Cole's wallet. Cole and Catherine, before time and grief had carved their marks. "Your room's upstairs," Cole continued. "End of the hall. Small, but it's got a good bed and a window that catches the morning light." He led her up a staircase with a polished banister, Margaret's hand trailing along the smooth wood, feeling the years of other hands that had touched it before hers. The room was small, like he'd said, but it had a real bed with a cotton mattress and a quilt folded at the foot. Blue and white, a pattern her grandmother would have called wedding ring. A washstand stood in the corner with a pitcher and basin. And the window. The window had curtains, simple muslin, but curtains she could close. A door that locked. Margaret stood in the doorway, her trunk at her feet, and looked at the space that was now hers. "It's not much," Cole said from behind her. "It's more than I've had in a good long while." She stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under her weight, a friendly sound like the house was saying hello. "Supper's at 6. Ruth will want to meet you proper. Get yourself settled and I'll see you then." His footsteps retreated down the hallway. Margaret listened until they faded, then closed the door. Turned the lock. The click echoed in the quiet room. She sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress gave beneath her soft, impossibly soft after weeks on a horse blanket and hard ground. She pressed her palms against the quilt, feeling the tiny stitches, the pattern of interlocking circles. Someone had made this. Someone had sat for hours, needle in hand, creating something beautiful and warm, and now it was hers to use. Margaret lay back on the bed, stared at the ceiling, listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, the tick of cooling wood, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the lowing of cattle far away. For the first time in weeks, she didn't have to be anywhere, didn't have to work for anyone, didn't have to worry about the next meal or the next day's wages. She closed her eyes just for a moment and slept. The smell of biscuits woke her. Margaret's eyes opened to lamplight and shadows. She'd slept through the afternoon. The window showed purple sky and the first stars emerging over the hills. She sat up fast. "Supper at 6, he'd said. What time was it now?" She splashed water on her face from the basin, smoothed her hair back, brushed the wrinkles from her dress as best she could. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed a woman with tired eyes but a determined jaw. "You can do this," she told herself. "You've done harder things." She went downstairs following the smell and sound to the kitchen. The kitchen was warm with aromas Margaret had almost forgotten. Fresh bread and roasting meat and coffee percolating in a pot on the back of the stove. A woman stood at the counter, her back to the door hands, working a bowl of something with practiced movements. Gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, shoulders squared like a soldier's, an apron that had seen years of use and showed every one of them. "You're late." The voice was sharp, but not unkind. "Supper's been ready 10 minutes. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I fell asleep. The bed was—" Margaret stopped suddenly, embarrassed. "I'm not used to beds like that." The woman turned. Ruth Patterson had a face that looked like it had been carved from oak, all angles and planes weathered by time and trouble. Her eyes were gray as storm clouds, and they traveled over Margaret with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent a lifetime taking the measure of people. "You're the one who kept him breathing." "Yes, ma'am." Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, nodded toward a table in the corner of the kitchen. Smaller than the grand dining table, scarred by years of use, surrounded by 4 mismatched chairs. "Sit." Margaret hesitated. "I can help serve if you need." "I said sit." Margaret sat. Ruth moved to the stove, ladled stew from a cast-iron pot into a deep bowl. Full portion, not the servant's scraps Margaret had half expected. She added a biscuit from the oven, golden brown and steaming, set the bowl in front of Margaret with a thunk that rattled the spoon. "Anyone who hauls Mr. Brennan out of a creek and keeps him alive for 5 days on bone broth and yarrow earns a seat at my table." Ruth's voice was gruff, but something softer moved behind those storm-gray eyes. "Now eat. You look like you haven't had a proper meal since Methuselah was a boy." Margaret picked up the spoon. Her hand trembled. The first bite hit her tongue. Beef and potatoes and onions seasoned with herbs she couldn't name, rich and hot and more flavorful than anything she'd eaten in months. Her eyes stung. She ate slowly, deliberately. If she ate too fast, she would cry. And she wasn't about to cry in front of this woman who watched her with those knowing eyes. Ruth poured coffee into a tin cup, set it beside Margaret's bowl, then sat down across from her with her own cup, saying nothing, just being present while Margaret ate. When the bowl was empty, Ruth refilled it without being asked. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank the Lord and the cow that gave its life." Ruth's voice was dry. "You can earn your keep starting tomorrow. The pantry's a disaster. The linens haven't been properly sorted in a year, and I'm too old to be climbing ladders to dust the high shelves." "Yes, ma'am." "And it's Ruth. Just Ruth. I'm too old for all that ma'am business, too." Something loosened in Margaret's chest. She nodded. "You'll do," Ruth said, studying her over the rim of her coffee cup. "I reckon you'll do just fine." The first week passed in a blur of work. Margaret threw herself into it the way she'd thrown herself into every job she'd ever had, wholly, completely, like her life depended on it. Because maybe it did. She cleaned rooms that hadn't been touched in months, beating rugs until her arms ached, scrubbing floors until the wood gleamed. She sorted linens, mended curtains, organized the pantry until Ruth could find things without having to dig through 3 shelves of unlabeled jars. The house had been maintained, but not loved. Margaret could see it in the corners where dust had gathered in the windows that hadn't been washed since spring, in the dining room that sat empty meal after meal. She set about changing that. On the 4th day, Ruth found her elbow deep in the root cellar sorting potatoes from onions from turnips. "You know how to bone a chicken." Margaret looked up. "Taught myself when I was 12. My mother took sick one winter. Someone had to feed the family." Ruth nodded slowly. Something shifted in her expression. Not approval exactly, but something close to it. "Dinner's at 6. I'll show you where we keep the knives." Tommy thrived in ways Margaret had never seen. The ranch hands took to him, teaching him to rope and ride, treating him like a little brother instead of a burden. He helped Henry in the stables learn the names of every horse, came to meals dirty and happy, and so full of stories he could barely eat. "Aunt Maggie, did you know horses can sleep standing up, and that bulls can weigh 2,000 pounds, and that Henry once wrestled a steer to the ground with his bare hands?" Margaret smiled, ruffled his hair, let him talk himself breathless. This was the life she'd promised Emily, the life she'd traveled 2,000 miles to find, and somehow, impossibly, she'd found it. On the 7th evening, Margaret found Cole on the front porch. He sat in one of the rocking chairs, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sun drop toward the western hills. The light turned his face gold and amber, softening the lines around his eyes. A second cup sat on the small table beside him, steam curling up into the cooling air. Margaret stopped at the door. "I didn't mean to interrupt your quiet." "You're not." Cole nodded toward the empty chair. "Sit, please. Ruth said you've been working yourself to the bone all week. You've earned a rest." She hesitated, then crossed the porch, lowered herself into the rocker. The wood creaked beneath her weight, a comfortable sound like the chairs remembered being sat in. The coffee was hot and strong, bitter the way she liked it. Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup, let the warmth seep into her work-sore fingers. They sat in silence for a while. The sun sank lower, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the distance a mockingbird sang its evening song. 3 notes repeated, then 3 more. "You've made a difference," Cole said finally. "The house feels different. Ruth noticed it too. It just needed some attention. Most things do." He took a sip of his coffee. "People too, I reckon." The mockingbird sang again. Margaret watched a line of cattle moving across the far pasture, dark shapes against the golden grass. "Can I ask you something?" Cole's voice was quiet. "Depends on what it is." "The photograph in my wallet. The woman with the gray hair. You saw it that first night." Margaret's hands tightened on her cup. "I figured she was your mother. My wife, Catherine. She passed on 8 years ago come spring. Fever took her. Same fever that almost took me when I was a boy." He paused. "We were married 11 years. I built this ranch for her. Every room, every fence post, every acre. I thought if I worked hard enough I could give her everything she deserved." His voice dropped. "She died 3 months after we finished the house, and our daughter Sarah died a week later. Same fever." Margaret's breath caught. "Cole, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "It was a long time ago, 8 years now. She's been gone longer than we were married." He looked at his coffee cup like he could read something in its depths. "Some nights I walk through this house and wonder who I built it for. All these rooms, all this space, and just me rattling around in it like a marble in a barrel." Margaret stared at the horizon. The sun had touched the hills, now spilling red across the sky. "Maybe," she said slowly, "you'll figure that out. What it was all for." She didn't look at him when she said it. He didn't look away from her. The silence stretched between them, full of things neither was ready to say. Margaret finished her coffee, set the cup on the table, rose from the chair. "Good night, Cole." "Margaret." She paused at the door. "Good night." She went inside, climbed the stairs, locked herself in her room, stood at the window, looking out at the darkening land. Her hand rested on the glass. 8 years. He'd been alone in this house for 8 years, carrying a photograph and a memory. Margaret reached into her apron pocket, found the folded paper that had lived there for months. The marriage certificate. Harold J. Finch. William Barrett. William Bradford. Whatever his real name was. She looked at it in the dying light, looked at the land beyond her window, looked at the quilt on the bed and the door with its lock and the life that might be waiting if she was brave enough to reach for it. 8 years was a long time to carry the dead. Maybe it was time to let them go. 2 weeks became a month. The hill country turned gold and rust with October the sycamores and cottonwoods blazing color while the live oaks held their stubborn green. Margaret stood at the kitchen window in the gray light of early morning, watching mist rise from the pastures, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Behind her, Ruth hummed an old hymn while she kneaded bread dough. Amazing Grace. The same tune Margaret's grandmother used to hum over her washboard back in Pennsylvania. The sound had become part of the rhythm of Margaret's days, along with the creak of the porch boards at dawn and the distant lowing of cattle, and the particular way the house settled into quiet after supper. "You're thinking too loud," Ruth said without turning around. Her hands never stopped their work. Press, fold, turn. "I can hear it all the way over here." Margaret smiled into her coffee. "Just watching the morning come in." Ruth's voice was dry. "That why you've been staring at that same patch of pasture for 10 minutes?" She paused. "He's been asking about you. You know, every morning at breakfast. Where you are, what you're doing, whether you've eaten." Margaret's fingers tightened on the cup. "He asks about everyone. He doesn't ask about everyone the way he asks about you." Ruth turned her gray eyes sharp as always, but something gentler underneath. "I've known that man 30 years, child. Watched him court. Catherine watched him mourn her. I know what it looks like when Cole Brennan's heart starts beating for something besides cattle and fence posts." Margaret set her cup in the basin, tied her apron tighter. "I've got work to do." "That you do." Ruth went back to her bread. "That you do." The transformation of the house continued. Margaret placed wildflowers in a jar at the center of the dining table. Late blooming asters, purple and white, gathered from the meadow behind the barn. She mended the curtains in Cole's study, organized his bookshelves, found a photograph of his parents buried in a desk drawer, cleaned the frame, and hung it in the hallway where the morning light could catch it. Small changes, but they added up to something that felt like home. One afternoon, as Margaret was dusting the parlor, she heard horses approaching. Multiple riders. She moved to the window, watched as a fancy carriage pulled by matched bays rolled up the drive, followed by 2 riders on horseback. The carriage door opened and a woman emerged, 60 years old perhaps. Steel gray hair pulled back in an elaborate style. Expensive traveling dress that spoke of money and status. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to deference. Behind her, a younger woman stepped down, 28 or so, attractive in a refined way, wearing clothes that matched the older woman's quality, if not quite her severity. Margaret's stomach tightened. She didn't know who these women were, but she knew trouble when she saw it coming up a drive. Cole appeared from the barn, his expression shifting when he saw the carriage. Not pleasure. Something closer to resignation. "Victoria," his voice carried through the open window. "I wasn't aware you were visiting." "Visiting?" The older woman's voice could have cut glass. "I've come to retrieve what remains of my daughter's legacy, and I find you've replaced her with this." She gestured toward the house, toward the windows, toward Margaret visible in the parlor. Margaret stepped back from the glass, but not before Victoria's eyes locked on her. This, she realized with sinking certainty, was Catherine's mother. Within minutes, Margaret found herself summoned to the parlor. Ruth appeared at her elbow, her expression grim. "Victoria Hartley, Catherine's mother. Come to make trouble like always." "Why now?" "Because she's a vulture, and she smells change." The parlor felt smaller with Victoria in it. She sat in the best chair, her posture perfect, her eyes taking in every detail with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. The younger woman stood near the window, uncomfortable but resigned. Cole stood by the fireplace, his jaw tight. When Margaret entered, his eyes found hers something apologetic in them. Victoria's gaze raked over Margaret from head to toe. "So, this is the woman who's been living under my son-in-law's roof, unchaperoned, unseemly." "Margaret Fletcher," Margaret said evenly. "Housekeeper." "Housekeeper." Victoria's tone made the word sound like an accusation. "How convenient." "Mother." The younger woman spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a note of warning. Perhaps nothing, Elizabeth. Someone needs to speak truth." Victoria turned to Cole. "James, Catherine has been dead for 8 years. I've tolerated your mourning, your isolation. But this, bringing a woman of questionable background into Catherine's home, this is my home, Victoria, and Miss Fletcher's background is none of your concern." "It is when it affects my daughter's memory." Victoria rose, drawing herself to her full height. "The Ladies' Society is already talking. Do you know what they're saying? That you've installed a mail-order bride who trapped you while you were vulnerable. That she has a child she's trying to pass off as respectable. The boy is her nephew, and she saved my life." "So you've said. How convenient that no one can verify the circumstances. How convenient that you were alone, injured, dependent on her charity." Victoria's eyes glittered. "I want her gone, James. For Catherine's sake, for propriety's sake. Send her away and marry Elizabeth. Unite our families as Catherine would have wanted." The room went silent. Elizabeth stepped forward, her face flushed. "Mother, that's enough." "Elizabeth is 28, Victoria continued as if her daughter hadn't spoken. "Past prime marrying age. You owe this to Catherine. Give her sister the life Catherine never finished living." Cole's voice, when it came, was cold enough to freeze water. "I owe Catherine respect for what we had, not the sacrifice of what I might have now." "What you might have with her." Victoria's gesture toward Margaret carried contempt. "A nobody from nowhere with nothing to offer but desperation." Margaret had heard enough. She stepped forward, her own spine straightening. "Mrs. Hartley, I understand your grief. I do. but I won't be used as a pawn in it." She held up a hand as Victoria opened her mouth to interrupt. "I came to Texas because a man lied to me, stole from me, from 17 other women just like me. I've spent weeks believing I wasn't worth the truth, that I deserved abandonment." Margaret's voice strengthened. "But I saved a man's life. I earned honest work. I've made a home here with people who see me as I am." She looked directly at Victoria. "If you want to destroy that with gossip and scandal, do it, but you won't make me ashamed of surviving." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Elizabeth spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Mother, stop." Everyone turned. Catherine wouldn't want this. She wouldn't want James forced into anything. She wouldn't want her memory used as a weapon. "How dare you?" "I loved my sister." Elizabeth's eyes shone with tears. "But I won't dishonor her memory by coercing a man who doesn't love me into a marriage neither of us wants." She looked at Margaret. "Miss Fletcher, I apologize for my mother's behavior, and for mine in not stopping her sooner." Elizabeth moved toward the door. "I'll be in the carriage when you're ready to leave, Mother." She walked out, her departure somehow louder than any argument. Victoria stood frozen, her carefully constructed attack crumbling. She looked at Cole, at Margaret, back to Cole. "This isn't over." "Yes," Cole said quietly. "It is. Get off my land." Victoria swept out, her dignity intact, but her victory lost. The front door closed with a decisive click. Margaret's legs suddenly felt unsteady. She sat down before they could give out. "I should leave," she said. "This will only get worse." Cole crossed to her, knelt so they were eye level. "Do you want to leave?" "No. But what I want doesn't matter. The town, the gossip, your reputation." "The hell with the town. The hell with gossip." His hands gripped hers. "Do you want to leave?" Margaret looked at him, at the man who'd trusted her when he had every reason not to, who'd fought for her, who'd given her and Tommy a home when they had nothing. "No," she whispered. "I don't want to leave." "Then stay. Fight for it with me." He reached up his hand, cupping her cheek. The moment stretched. Margaret's breath caught. "Mr. Brennan," Ruth's voice from the kitchen urgent. "Tommy's asking for you. Something about the mare foaling." The spell broke. Cole stood, stepping back, his hand falling away. "I should go. He needs you." Cole left. Margaret sat alone in the parlor, her hand pressed over her racing heart. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret lit her lamp and sat on the edge of her bed. She reached into the drawer of her nightstand, pulled out the marriage certificate she'd kept hidden these months. She unfolded it slowly. The paper was so worn now it threatened to fall apart along its creases. William Barrett's signature stared up at her. That confident scrawl she'd once believed in with her whole heart. 6 months of letters. $40 for a train ticket. A promise that turned to smoke the moment she'd needed it to be real. Margaret had carried this wound across 1,000 miles, nursed it through weeks of scrubbing floors and begging Scraps, let it whisper in her ear every night that she wasn't worth staying for, wasn't worth coming for, wasn't worth the ink it took to write her name. No more. She rose from the bed, crossed to the small stove in the corner of her room, opened the iron door. The coals glowed orange inside, banked for the night, but still breathing. She struck a match, held the flame to the corner of the certificate. The paper caught. Fire licked up the edges, consuming William Barrett's signature, consuming the county seal, consuming every lie and broken promise she'd carried from Pennsylvania. Margaret watched it burn. The flames turned the paper brown, then black, then ash. It curled in on itself and crumbled, falling into the coals like it had never existed at all. She closed the stove door, stood there in the quiet room, her hand on the warm iron, and breathed. "The Lord doesn't waste pain," her mother used to say. "Every hard thing we go through, He uses to make us ready for what comes next." Margaret finally understood. The next morning she found Ruth in the kitchen, kneading bread as always. "I need to ask you something," Margaret said. Ruth's hands stilled. What Catherine was like. What she would have wanted. Ruth studied her for a long moment, then wiped her hands on her apron. "Come with me." She led Margaret to the master bedroom. Cole's room, a space Margaret had never entered. Ruth pulled a small wooden box from the wardrobe. "Catherine gave me this 3 days before she died. Made me promise to give it to Cole when he was ready to love again." She held out the box. "I think maybe it's meant for you." Inside were 2 letters, one addressed, "To James when you're ready." The other, in the same elegant hand, "To the woman who finally sees him." "Cole already read his," Ruth said quietly. "This morning. That's why he went to his study. That's why he had the ring ready." Margaret's hands trembled. Cole had already known, had already received Catherine's blessing, and he'd still been nervous, still been uncertain because he wanted Margaret's answer to be freely given, not influenced by a dead woman's words. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. The letter was long, intimate, heartbreaking. Catherine wrote of loving Cole, but never feeling fully seen by him, of his language being action rather than words, of realizing too late that he'd shown his love in every fence post, every planted tree, every quiet moment of presence. She wrote of her one wish that Cole would find someone who understood his silent devotion, someone who would love the man, not the monument. The final lines made Margaret's eyes blur. "Don't let him hide behind guilt. Don't let small-minded people steal what you found together. The ranch needs someone who sees it as home, not monument. James needs someone who sees him as a man, not a memory. I think you might be both. Take care of him. Take care of this place. Live the life I couldn't finish." Margaret's tears fell on the paper. Ruth's weathered hand covered hers. She'd want this child. She'd want you. That evening Margaret found Cole in his study going over ledgers by lamplight. "Can we talk?" He looked up, set down his pen. "Always." She closed the door, sat in the chair across from his desk. "Ruth showed me Catherine's letter." Cole went very still. "She had no right. She had every right. And Catherine—" "Cole, she gave you permission. She wants you to be happy." "I am happy, or I'm learning to be. With me." The question hung between them. Cole rose, came around the desk, knelt before her chair, just as he had after Victoria's visit. "Margaret Fletcher, you're the strongest, bravest, most stubborn woman I've ever known. You saved my life. You've made this house a home again. You've made me want to live instead of just survive." He pulled something from his pocket. A ring. Simple gold, worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's. I gave it to Catherine on our wedding day. Found it in her jewelry box after she passed." His hands trembled slightly. "I'm asking anyway. I know I'm not what you dreamed of on that train from Pennsylvania. I know I'm old and scarred and carrying ghosts. But I'm real. This is real. Cole, marry me. Not because you need saving. Not because I owe you. But because when I'm with you, I finally understand what Catherine meant. You make me want to be seen. You make me want to live." Margaret's tears came freely now. "The town. We'll learn to live with it, or they won't. I don't care." She looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the life being offered. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." He slipped the ring on her finger. It fit like it had been waiting for her all along. Cole pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "Thank you," he breathed, "for saying yes, for everything. Thank you for seeing me." They stayed like that for a long moment, 2 broken people choosing to be broken together, choosing to build something new from the ruins of what they'd lost. The wedding took place 3 weeks later on the ranch porch at sunset. Small ceremony. Intimate. Ruth as matron of honor. Henry as best man. Tommy standing beside Margaret beaming. A few ranch hands. Reverend Thomas from town. And surprisingly, Elizabeth Hartley, who'd traveled from Dallas to attend her mother conspicuously absent. Margaret wore a simple cream dress Ruth had helped her sew. Wildflowers in her hair, the same ones she'd picked for the dining table months ago. Cole wore his Sunday suit nervous in a way Margaret had never seen him, his hands shaking slightly when he took hers. The sun painted the sky amber and rose as they spoke their vows. "Margaret Ann Fletcher." Cole said, "I don't have fancy words. Never have. But I promise you this, I see you. Not as the woman who saved my life though you did, not as housekeeper or helper, but as the person who taught me that home isn't a place. It's where someone truly knows you and stays anyway. His voice caught. I'll spend every day trying to deserve you. I'll probably fail most days, but I'll keep trying. You're worth fighting for. This us is worth fighting for. Margaret's turn. James Cole Brennan. I came to Texas chasing a promise that didn't exist, but I found one that did. You gave me work when I had nothing, respect when I'd been abandoned, trust when I'd been lied to. She squeezed his hands. I promised to see you. Not the ranch, not the legacy. Just you. The man who sits quiet on the porch, who builds with his hands and loves with his presence. I'll make this house a home, not because I'm supposed to, but because it already is, because you're here. Reverend Thomas smiled. By the power vested in me by the state of Texas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Cole, you may kiss your bride. He did. The small crowd cheered. The sunset was perfect. 2 months later, on a crisp December afternoon, Margaret and Cole rode together to Cypress Creek, the place where it all began. They dismounted at the exact spot where Margaret had found him dying. Feverfew no longer bloomed, but the creek ran clear as ever over limestone catching the winter light. Margaret knelt, picked up a smooth stone from the water's edge. Hard to believe it's been only 7 months. Longest and shortest 7 months of my life. She stood, tucked the stone in her pocket. Do you think Catherine would approve? Cole pulled her close. I know she would. Her letter said as much. Ruth told me Catherine loved this creek, used to come here to think. She did, said it was where she felt closest to God. They stood in silence, water sounds and bird song around them. I used to think, Margaret said quietly, that the Lord brought me to Texas to punish me. Abandonment felt like judgment. And now I think He brought me here to save us both. You from slowly dying, me from slowly disappearing. Cole kissed her forehead. Welcome home, Mrs. Brennan. Margaret smiled, leaned into him. Welcome home. The camera of memory pulls back. 2 figures by the creek bathed in golden light. The ranch visible in the distance. Cattle lowing. Home. Margaret Fletcher had come to Texas on a lie. She'd found truth instead, found family, found herself, found a man whose silent devotion spoke louder than any words written on paper. Some promises are made to be broken. Others are forged in fire and tested by time and proven true. She'd learned the difference, and in learning, she'd found her way home.